This is Anna Pinedo, and I'm a partner in the New York office of Mayor Brown in the Capital Markets Group. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Fred Samama to join us for a webcast at a tipping point, ESG and responsible investing. So before I introduce Fred, just a few words on our capital markets group and our focus on ESG investing. So over the last number of years, as our clients, both issuers and investment banks, have become significantly more focused on structuring financial products, including green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, social bonds, and our issuer clients have become increasingly interested in offering these securities. We have been working on a variety of instruments as well as on crafting disclosures in relation to these particular types of financial instruments, as well as working on fund-linked products and proprietary indices that focus on various aspects of ESG investing. Obviously, that comes as no surprise, given that we're seeing a continuing increase in the amount of interest in ESG investing. Today, Morningstar released a report that showed an increase in the first quarter of this year to almost $2 trillion, an increase of almost 19% in the amount of funds invested in ESG product. So this is a very timely presentation. As Fred will probably mention, he and I have had the great pleasure of working together over a number of years, and Fred is the head of responsible investment at CPR AM, Amundi Group. He's also the founder of SWF Research Initiative and the co-editor of a book on long-term investing with Nobel Prize winning laureate Joseph Stiglitz and Professor Patrick Bolton. He's a prolific author. He's written quite a number of papers on green finance and green investing. A number of his publications have been featured in the Financial Times, in Gillian Tebbett's Green Books, Top 10 ESG Reads, and before focusing on these matters, Fred had a career in corporate equity derivatives at Credit Agricole. So I'm going to hand it off to Fred, who is going to go through his presentation, and we'll save a little time for questions at the end. You can also feel free during the course of the presentation to, pardon me, to type some questions into the chat, and Melissa will keep track of those as we go through the slides today. So Fred, again, thank you, welcome, and off to you.
Thank you, Anna, and it's really a pleasure to be almost with you today from Paris, and absolutely it has been a long journey together, and you deserve, Anna, a lot of credit because you took that topic when it was not so popular, and your passion, your interest has been constant over the years. So you deserve a lot of credit, and so I'm very glad to present with you today. In my introduction, so next, I would like, as you said, Anna, we are observing a tsunami. ESG and climate change is clearly all around the world becoming the new normal. And we have the figures. We see that Deutsche Bank think that by the end of the decade, it will be 95% of the assets, and so on and so on. Truth is, as well, that there is still a lack of clarity on the objectives behind ESG and maybe about the impacts on returns. And so I will elaborate quickly on this. And within ESG, we can say that there is an even bigger wave that is about climate change. That's where everything changed at the COP21. Suddenly the world woke up. And now you have about 90 central banks, including the Fed, that have put climate change on the agenda because they are understanding that it threatens financial stability. And so if it's true for 90 central banks, it's true for all investors around the planet. And here what becomes very interesting is that it has triggered different answers from clients. For sure, they integrated the risks, but they went even further. They decided to engage with corporates, and I will elaborate about Climate Action 100 that represents about $50 trillion engaging with the most polluting companies. And even better, they decided to make markets more resilient. And I will show two initiatives where that led to the development of low carbon indexes and the largest ever green bond fund. And I will conclude my presentation with two other new developments, the hot topics these days. The first is about impact investing. That is still more European stuff. And the fact that more and more investors are getting committed to be net zero. And that's a new challenge for the entire industry, and I will explain why. So again, I will start with the tsunami, the challenges associated with that, climate change, the engagement of investors, two innovations, two financial innovations, impact investing and net zero. And I will try to do it in the next 30 or 40 minutes. Next. So Anna, you were kind enough to refer to the academic center I launched at Columbia University with Professor Stiglitz, Bolton. I launched as well the first ever coalition of investors committed to align their portfolios with a low carbon economy. I've published papers. I've been testifying before the US Senate last year. I'm advising the French government, and I've published many papers. The last one is the Green Swan, co-written with the Banque de France and the BIS, and it has downloaded more than 100,000 times. Next. So the tsunami, here are the figures. Last year or 2 years ago, Deutsche Bank said it's a $30 trillion market, and they estimated then that the market could grow by $15 trillion, reaching $45 trillion by the end of this year. And what is even more interesting is that they think that by the end of this decade, it will represent $125 trillion, meaning 95% of the AUM. So it's just on track to become the new normal. And you see that the tipping point was around the COP21. Next. Now what things are getting more complicated. The question is, what kind of data do we have? And how can we compare the ratings from one agency to the other one? Here you have a graph coming from GPIF, you know, the $1.6 trillion pension fund, Japanese one, that asks two providers, FTSE and MSCI, to compare the ESG ratings coming from the top 450 Japanese companies. Absolutely no correlation on the top 450 Japanese companies. It's really surprising because if you do the same exercise on the credit analysis between Moody's, S&P, and so on, you will get a very high correlation. So the question becomes, how is that possible? Such an absolute lack of correlation. Next. And to try to answer this question with Patrick Bolton and Simon Levin from Princeton, we recently published a paper in a book, and we said the reason behind is that actually behind ESG, you have very different objectives depending on the investors. For some of them, it's about the values, like to be Shia compliant, to exclude tobacco, gambling, and so on. Interestingly, the literature is pretty clear, and that there is a cost associated when you exclude something based on values. To give a concrete example, if you had invested $1 in 1900, the very same dollar would have delivered in 2014, 115 years later, about $38,000. $1, 38,000. But the very same dollar into tobacco companies that maybe you want to exclude would have generated $6.3 million, meaning that one of the best possible investments in the 20th century was tobacco. So if you decide to exclude it, you have to be ready to lose the returns. Now, it can be about signals, engagement, reports, investment into green bonds, and so on. By definition, you're not shifting your portfolios, so it's market neutral. And then it can be about long-term risk management and sizing opportunities. Here, you have to ask yourself, okay, fine, but why is an ESG analyst bringing something that the other analysts are not delivering? We can see three reasons. The first one is that very often an ESG analyst has a kind of 360 analysis. He or she pays attention to governance, controversies, and so on. The case study is about Volkswagen. Nobody knew that they were lying before the Dieselgate that started in California. But some ESG analysts observed that the governance at the top level of the firm was pretty weak. And so there was a red flag from MSCI, for example. The second reason is that corporates are evolving into an environment, and the environment can shift, like tax evasion, we could say, or and so on. Here, the ESG analyst tries to see over the long run what can be the societal shifts. And third, some sectors are sometimes facing an existential threat, and it's very difficult to think about it within the industry. The classical example is about climate change that is really threatening the license to operate from many corporates. And so what I'm trying to say here is that the ESG analyst can bring an additional perspective to the standard one being provided by the regular analyst. But then next, we have to remind ourselves, and that's another graph that comes from the paper with Patrick Bolton and Simon Levin, is to say that when you've done that, you've done only half of the job, because you have maybe identified an exposure. But then the question becomes, beyond the exposure, what are the returns associated? A risk is not a bad thing by itself. The question is what kind of rewards you have with the risks. And here what we say that it depends on the level of adoption by the investors. If you're still at the discovering process, it's maybe too early. But if you just get the tipping point where investors are starting to pay attention, and so they're asking a return associated with a risk that was not observed before, then you can capture something by selling the shares. But then the risk gets rewarded. And even better, it can shift towards a moral ban, and then the returns are getting very high. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you start too early, you're losing returns. Then you make money, and then you lose and lose again. So ESG, when people are saying, well, by integrating ESG, I will outperform and so on. No, it really depends on the level of adoption on the topic by the industry. Next. So it's all about dynamic ESG. And I tend to believe that it's slightly not perceived well enough. Now about climate change. We know the challenge. We are on the way to double the emissions, and instead of being there, we have to cut to almost zero the emissions by 2050. We have never faced such a challenge. It means that all countries, all sectors, all corporates will be impacted. There will be no silver bullet. It's just the biggest challenge because we need to change entirely the way we are doing business. If not, next, the situation is just a disaster. You have many ways to say it, but here there's a graph coming from Nature published about 4 years ago that makes the case that if we are on the usual business as usual path, then about 4 to 5 billion people will be at risk for their lives. Why? Because they will live in regions where it will be hot and humid. We are human beings. We need to regulate our internal temperatures, and for that, we need to sweat. And if outside it's hot and humid, you can't. And so you have the graph that shows the number of days above which your life is at risk. Red means all year long. So concretely, if we are on the wrong path, by the end of the century, it will not be possible to live in South America, Central America, part of the US, Africa, India, Indonesia, Australia. 4 to 5 billion people. Millions of migrants, chaos, wars, whatever. And you could say, okay, fine, it's by the end of the century. Maybe I won't be around. But the World Bank say that already by 2050, and in only 3 regions, including South America, Africa, and India, we could have 143 million migrants due to climate change. 143 million. It's huge. Only 3 regions. Next. Now you could ask me, okay, fine. We see the big problem at the level of the planet, but what about the asset prices? And here it's extremely complicated. It's complicated because you have 3 blocks of influences on the asset prices. The first one is that you can say it's the regulation is booming. I have many slides available showing that after the COP21, carbon taxes, regulations on products, regulations on capital markets, they are all converging on putting some pressure on the polluting companies. And very often they're abrupt. Like in Europe, after the Dieselgate with Volkswagen, suddenly the European Commission totally shifted its policy with the auto car makers. Almost overnight, they had to stop producing the diesel cars while representing 60% of the market, like in France. And some companies could not adjust, like Fiat. They had to merge. They didn't have the technology, they didn't have the engineers. They were caught by surprise, and they disappeared. After that, you have society with the millennials, the technological shifts, migrations, health, and nature, extreme weather events. They've been multiplied by 4 over the past 40 years. You have more and more droughts, typhoons, and so on. And the insurance gap is huge. 56% in the US, 92% in Asia, 97% in Africa, meaning that when something happens, people are losing their homes and assets. The sea level is rising, but it at risk many real estate properties, water scarcity. Some estimate that by 2060, about 40% or 60% of the world population could suffer from water scarcity, agriculture, and so on. And so what happens is that all these forces are impacting asset prices. They have a lot of non-linearities, abrupt shocks, and they are interacting with each other. When something happens in nature, it triggers a new regulation or society and policymakers. So it means that it's not a shock like an equity market drop, a rise of inflation, and so on. Multiple forces, non-linearities interacting with each other. Next. And that's what we have said in this book I mentioned in my introduction, the Green Swan, that I've been honored to publish with two central banks, Banque de France and BIS, saying that the Green Swan is certain, carries a lot of non-linearities, and could put human life at risk. So it's a risk that is a systemic one and cannot be hedged. And the COVID-19 is another example of Green Swan. The book is freely online. And the Fed has kindly referred to it, as well as the ECC in your country. Next. And so to make a long story short about this first part, yes, you have this cartoon that you've maybe seen before. Yeah, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So maybe we are as well slightly ending the Milton Friedman's period. Next. And now what becomes interesting is the reaction of investors facing this new reality, this new massive risk. They got super active. And I will give three examples. The first one is about CalPERS that started about 4 years ago, Climate Action 100, meaning that they have decided to cooperate with their peers and to engage with the most polluting companies. And quickly it became huge. Now there are 500 investors representing $47 billion, and they have decided to allocate the efforts between the group, and it works. Last year, Total, the French company, released a press release saying we have shifted based on the conversations we had with this group. We have shifted our policy. It was unthinkable just 2 or 3 years ago, and now it happens. And you can imagine when you're the CEO of a firm and you receive a phone call from an investor that has a group behind him or her representing $47 trillion, you take the call. Next. And now 2 concrete examples of financial innovation. Some investors have said, what does it mean to be a responsible investor? Does it mean to integrate ESG factors? Yes. Does it mean to engage? Yes. But can I do more than that? Some investors are saying maybe part of my responsibility is to make the markets more resilient. And here are 2 case studies with FRR, AP4, European Public Pension Funds, and IFC. Next. On the first one, about 10 years ago, one of my clients, the CEO of AP4, challenged me to find a solution to reduce climate change-related risks on a large scale. And he said to me, if you find something, I'm committed to decarbonize 5 to 10% of my $40 billion pension fund. It was a good challenge. Unfortunately, I didn't find anything. So I was very disappointed. And then I came back to him and said, okay, I didn't find any way to do the job. So, but what do you have in your portfolio? And he said, well, like all investors, I have a lot of passive products. And then I teamed up internally and we created a team that said, okay, what is an index? It's just a series of companies. And on the other hand, we had some carbon data. So we thought that we could screen the constituents of the index and take out the most polluting companies and replace them with their peers that were better positioned. Basically, we were inventing the Diet Coke for indexes. We take out the sugar, and at the end, we have the same taste. What is cool is that we could replace the most polluting companies with better positioned firms without changing the market exposure. Next. And what is even better is that although it was a prototype, and so we thought that it could generate some little costs, very quickly it delivered an outperformance. And now we have more than 10 years of track record, and it has delivered, as you see the figures, between 30 to 44 basis points per year of outperformances. It's huge. For passive products, it's huge. The best teams are delivering 2 or 3 bips. Here we talk about 10 times what passive teams can do. And so it makes a case as well that by being green, investors have not sacrificed returns, but the other way around. Next. Another, and this, I've published a paper in the Financial Analyst Journal, and the Harvard Business Review 2 years ago was kind enough to refer to my leadership and say that now CalSTRS, New York Retirement Fund, GPIF are all using this technology that already 2 years ago was at least representing at least a 50 billion market. Next. And now another case study of financial innovation. We all know that we have massive needs of green infrastructures financings in emerging markets. On the other hand, you have massive pools of assets in developed markets facing a low yield environment. And so the wrong allocation of capital is costly for both parties. With IFC, we analyze the reasons behind. 2 main reasons. The first one is that emerging markets are considered as too risky by many investors, and there's a lack of knowledge on infrastructures financing even locally or on the planet. Next. And so we invented a mechanism, you must read the graph from right to left, where the investors are investing into a fund that we are managing that benefits from a risk-sharing mechanism. So it means that IFC takes potentially the first loss. So we tackle the problem number 1, that EM could be considered as too risky. And then, moment of genius of IFC, the fund invests into green bonds issued by local banks in EMs, meaning that a Mexican bank, a Turkish bank, and so on will issue a green bond. So it means that we, as investors, will take the risks of the balance sheet, but the bank, having issued a green bond, will channel the money towards the green projects. And suddenly, with this single fund, we are deploying $2 billion. So it's another example where investors have been committed to help set up a structure that delivers some returns for them. IFC is very happy with the structure, while having an impact on society through financial innovation. Next. And when we talk, and the deal got a lot of recognition. My president, the president of the World Bank, mentioned it. I got 6 awards, including the prestigious PRI award, and now AIB and AIB are replicating the deal. Next. And I even published a paper with Xavier Muscat, former head of the French Treasury and former chief of staff of President Sarkozy. Now, 2 other things that are the hot topics these days. Impact investing, and I will conclude with net zero alignment. Impact investing say that corporates are evolving into an environment, as we said. And here you have secular trends like aging populations, disruption, and so on. And some others like climate change with all the forces we mentioned. Then the question is the corporate managed in a sustainable way? Board independence, gender policy, and so on and so on. That's ESG. But the question becomes, when you have these big forces influencing the corporate, what about the activity of the corporates? If the activity is aligned with the secular trends, like aging populations and so on, it's about thematic. If it's about something including a public good dimension, that impacts investing. Meaning if the corporate is aligned with a positive force through its activity, it benefits from that wind. And so it can do both returns and positive impacts on society. Concrete example, next. Next. Here, food for generations. It's a strategy. I'm not selling you anything for sure, but we all know that the world population is growing. We won a fantastic war 30 years ago with a drop of the extreme poverty. We have to remind ourselves that 30 years ago, about 30% of the world population was living in extreme poverty. Now it's less than 10%. The good news is that people want to have a better food and so on. But, so there's a fantastic growth opportunity, but we don't have the resources. We can't feed everybody on that trajectory. So one way to have an impact is to invest through the food chain in a very efficient way and to reduce the carbon intensity, the water intensity, or to improve the waste recycling. If you do so, you're helping people get access to food, and you're taking into account the constraints, and so you impact investing. And now to conclude with slightly a teaser, but it will be about net zero alignment. Next. Net zero alignment is a new hot topic. Because if the world woke up in 2015 at the COP21, everybody went into its own direction, governments, investors, and so on. And over the past 6 months, suddenly we have observed an alignment of planets. Everybody wants to get net zero committed. Governments, asset owners, they already represent 37 members with $5.7 trillion, or asset managers in the US, Fidelity, or BlackRock. Altogether, they represent $37 trillion. Huge numbers. So everybody says, I want to be net zero. Next. The problem is that when you make some simulations, net zero means that you must have zero emissions in your portfolio. The problem is that when you do the estimates, it's exactly the other way around. The emissions are on the rise. So investors are increasingly getting committed to reduce to zero. Almost, in reality, corporates are on the other way around. How do you do? Many brands are working on this question around the planet. I do. And next. And at a major conference that I'm co-organizing in 1 month from now, the Green Swan conference, organized with the IMF, the BIS, the Banque de France, and the group of the central banks, I will disclose a methodology based on that on a paper that shows that we can do it. And so I'm slightly sorry, but you will have to wait 1 month to see the new slides dedicated to it. So to conclude, but it's feasible. That's the good news. To conclude, over the past 10 years, we have observed a fascinating moment. What was a niche market, something that was discussed sometimes during academic conferences or within NGOs, has totally shifted mainstream. As I said, about 90 central banks have put climate change on the agenda. You saw the figures about the investors being committed for almost $50 trillion and engaging with corporates and so on and so on. So that's really the new normal. And it's as well a fantastic call for financial innovation. because ESG and climate change are not only about integrating criteria into an investment process. It's as well to identify the gaps in the system and to try to fill them, and not necessarily to lose money, but the other way around. So again, I think that to conclude, we can identify 3 waves. The first one was the wake-up call, done. The second one is about clarity, still work in progress, but on good track. But then the third one is about financial innovation to make our markets more resilient. Today, I presented many solutions for the investors. We could think as well about the corporates. When they are engaged in this journey, they have to think as well about their capital structure. Do they have the right weight of long-term investors and so on? So all that is really the new frontier for the investment banks, the asset managers, and the lawyers. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. We'll open it up now to questions. If you have a question, feel free to unmute.
So I see a question. Can carbon credit play a meaningful role in achieving emissions target? Yes and no. Yes, because it's a way to finance some projects that otherwise would have not been alive. But no, because it cannot replace the fact that the corporates must cost to almost zero their emissions by 2050. So it's not about compensating, it's about the efforts that the corporates must do. Top of that, we can have on the road some emissions. For example, we have a strategy where we are already on the road to reduce the emissions, and although it's not required, we compensate the remaining emissions. So again, it cannot substitute the carbon reductions.
Additional questions for Fred? All right. Well, Fred, thank you so much for your comments today and for the very comprehensive.
There's a new question. What do you see as biggest? There's a new question. Sorry, Anna. What do you see as biggest obstacle now? There are still many obstacles. I would say the first one is that we don't have yet the carbon data of corporates. You know, you have 3 scopes: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and the data is still missing. The second obstacle is that too often people are still trying to assess the risks before taking action, and they don't realize how the clock is ticking. When we talk about climate change and we talk about neutrality, we only have in front of us about 10 years of carbon budget. So it means that what is feasible now is becoming increasingly complicated, not to say impossible, at the end of the decade. And I think this feeling of urgency is in some parts of the world within central banks, clearly, that are not panicking because the central bank cannot panic. But when Janet Yellen says, with climate change, we are facing an existential threat, that's big words. How many times have you heard? How many times have you heard the Treasury is saying we are facing an existential threat? I'm not sure that they said something like that during the financial crisis. And now they say it about climate change. So it says a lot. But I think that we are still, we are shifting from a world to another one, and never happens overnight. So people are still sometimes reluctant to understand that there's a new reality, and by losing time, they are losing money. What advice would you have for NGO with funds to allocate to the Green Swan to help advance? What advice would you have for NGO with funds? Oh, the Green Swan is a book, so you can't invest into allocate to the Green Swan to help advance the progress. If I understand correctly your question, I would say that how an NGO could be impactful. That's a good question. If the NGO is really a rich one, I would say to see the project. You know exactly what the FR and AP4 or IFC have done. They have said, we put on the table some money, some seed money, in order to create a vehicle that will solve a problem that was not tackled before. And by doing that, this fund will attract investment that will do the job that me, the NGO, I would have done on my balance sheet otherwise. I think that the most promising avenue. And if you ask me the list of things that we need to handle, the booming of the physical risks, for example. So now the question are coming, poof. How can pricing development with the price need to increase to meet? Well, how carbon to meet the 2015 net zero goal? Fascinating question. Fascinating question. The carbon tax in Europe was lagging at $4 or $5 forever. 2 years ago, the European Commission decided to fix it. And in almost 1 year, it shifted from 4.5 to 40. Huge. Have you ever seen a tax being increased so dramatically? And even better, the Banque de France, the French central bank, and the others released a report 6 months ago. They said, let's imagine we are delaying our answers on climate change. So let's imagine that on the road, we need to adjust abruptly the carbon tax to get corporates on the right track. Carbon tax, then $600 per ton. So if I had one advice, is really to pay attention to this tax, because that's the transmission tool that the policymakers have. Like central banks have the monetary policy, here the policymakers are using the carbon tax really to influence society. And it's moving very, very fast. The goal of the Green Swan, it was to, it's a good question. We published this book because we thought that if we didn't have the right framework on the risk, we couldn't have the right answers from the policymakers. So we said, be careful, it's not a risk like the others. It's a totally different risk. And it's exactly what we have observed with the COVID-19. It was a risk that was certain, also only Bill Gates could see it. A lot of non-linearities. It even triggered a deal between Russia and Saudi Arabia on the oil price. And third, it has killed hundreds of thousands of people not to say more. And suddenly the policymakers have changed their way of doing politics. So it means that we need to understand that climate change is a very similar risk. And so it's not like inflation and so on. It's new environment. Do you see any permanent changes coming out of the COVID, the cleanup over the last year? Are big political companies taking permanent steps? Yes. No, I think we have reached a tipping point. We have reached a tipping point with polluting countries shifting entirely their policies, like China. We have to remind ourselves that China was blocking any global agreements up to the COP21. And suddenly they helped close the deal. And why? Because now climate change is one of their top priorities. And what is extremely interesting is that with your new administration, suddenly between US, Europe, and China, you have a perfect alignment in their will to tackle climate change. And when you have an alignment, you even have a form of competition. And so to conclude on a very positive note, that's why I really think that we can be extremely confident that we will tackle one way or the other one climate change. Because now populations, policymakers, the price of renewable energy is dropping, capital markets are getting mobilized and so on. And we have to remind ourselves that everything I just described was unthinkable 6 years ago, before the COP21. So also climate change was on the table for decades, nothing was happening. And suddenly, over a very short period of time, all the planets got aligned. And when they got all aligned, you have a tipping point. That's exactly what we are living now.
So that's a good place to finish. Thank you very much, Ed, for your presentation and for taking time to answer questions and for joining us today.
It was my pleasure, Anna. Have a good day in New York.
Thank you. All right. See you. Bye.